Very pleased to have Chip Grote give our keynote addressing restoration plan for the Gulf of Mexico. Chip is with the Director of the Center for International Energy and Environmental Policy at the University of Texas. As a Gator, Chip, thanks so much. We really enjoy our new coach, Will Muschamp. He's no longer a coach in waiting. He's actually a head coach. So I just had to get that in. But Chip has a tremendous amount of scientific experience. He was the head of the USGS for a number of years and really championed this approach of an integrated scientific approach to restoration while he was at USGS. He also served as a Louisiana State geologist and directed the Coastal Zone Management Program there and stressed protection of the important coastal resources there in Louisiana. He has also served on the Outer Continental Shelf Policy Committee. That's easy to say. And a word that I've never ever used in public. His work includes resource and infrastructure development impacts on natural systems and the restoration ecology of these systems, desert, coastal, and fluvial systems, encompassing the evolution of landforms and the physical stratigraphy, forget it, of deposits and etc. Anyway, you get it. I'm not a scientist, you understand. But my son, who is larger than I am, by the way, is working on his master's in ecology at the University of Florida, so I hope y'all get a chance to meet him sometime. He's an excellent bass player. You get me with a harmonica, and we got two-thirds of the band anyway. So, Chip, with that introduction, I'm sorry I just kind of mangled it for you, but I'm sure you're going to do quite well plenary to get our restoration discussion off and going.
John, I'm not always sure what I do either, so thank you. I can't believe we've come this far, two-thirds of a day in a major conference, and we haven't yet seen a PowerPoint. Are you ready for some PowerPoint? I am going to show you some pictures. In fact, I think rather than a keynote, this is more of a responsibility to show in pictures some of the things that the last panel discussed, and hopefully be a segue into what you'll hear from the panel that John's going to lead about restoration. So let me begin then by, some might argue, splitting hairs. There are some differences between cleanup and restoration, because removing the oil is cleanup. Now, you could argue that it's very likely that most restoration efforts will be preceded by removing oil, particularly in shallow waters, coastal marsh areas. But the removal of the oil, the cleanup itself, does not constitute restoration of the habitats to the degree that we think of restoring those habitats to pre-spill conditions or to the productivity or delivering the services that we expected from them prior to an oil spill. And when we talk about restoration, we have to recognize that there is a significant difference between restoring beaches and wetlands and restoring deep Gulf areas, whether it's the water column or the bottom. In fact, one could discuss seriously whether or not cleanup beyond what's done initially in the face of the catastrophe and the efforts to stop the oil from spreading and the efforts to remove it as it emerges, whether it's from a tanker or a well, once we pass that stage of cleanup, how much cleanup actually is part of the restoration process after that? In other words, are we going to go back into the wetlands now and deal with the oil that's still there and eventually try to clean it up, to remove it? Is there any way we're going to go into the water column of the Gulf of Mexico or the bottom of the Gulf of Mexico where there may or may not be residual oil and actually clean it up? So when we talk about restoration, then we have to understand where we're going from a cleanup situation to a situation where we're really trying to restore the productivity of natural or human ecosystems. There's probably not a number related to the spill or response to it, or what's going to follow that isn't debated in some circles, or particularly scientific circles. And I present these numbers, these chiseled in stone to some. We see them often, 4.9 million barrels, but even those numbers will likely be contested in court, if nowhere else, because I think BP is of a different opinion as to how much oil actually entered the system and how much is still there. Just to illustrate what the panel was talking about and what Ed Overton and others were pointing out is, where did the oil go? Well, we know there was a certain amount that was cleaned up, in the sense that it was skimmed, it was retrieved, it was recovered as it emerged from the well itself in the later stages. And there's a certain amount of oil, about 42% residual oil and naturally dispersed oil, that theoretically at least is still out there somewhere. Whether out there means in the water column in the Gulf, whether out there means on the beaches or in the wetlands. So we're dealing still with a significant amount of oil that's in the natural system somewhere. Do we know where it is? Again, I think this panel preceding this talk pointed out very clearly we don't know nearly as much about it as we'd like to, and we don't have a very good history of learning that out, of learning that kind of information. Just to illustrate the oil that reached the surface in the Gulf and what it looked like and the efforts that were made to skim it, the goo that was referred to, the oil that is not the black, clean kind that most people think of, but the moussey kind of oil. And when we talk about cleanup as an initial stage to restoration, we have to be aware there's a fair amount of controversy surrounding cleanup processes themselves. Whether they themselves have a significant effect. We remember the Exxon Valdez, and yes, there was interest in removing that clearly present black oil from the sound, but there was an awful lot of discussion about whether or not the process itself, pressurized steamed waters on those cold water habitats, and when the oil was released where it went, as to whether that was more of a cleanup or restoration effort, or whether it was more additional damage to the systems that were being cleaned up. And when we see oil on a beach, on the surface, is there an acceptable way to remove that oil, to clean up that oil that will not be more damaging to the environment and the habitat that it coats or that it sits upon? So that's why I asked the question earlier. Now that we've reached the point where we've skimmed and retrieved and recovered the oil that was emerging, are we ever going to go back and actually clean up the oil that's there? Or do we look at restoration in another sense, restoring a habitat that may at the present time be oil? And I use this as a bit of a casual statement, but when we talked about cleanup, other than the skimming of the oil and the capture of the oil, what was done to the oil that actually got into the marsh, we saw a lot of newsreels of folks out there with essentially paper towels trying to wipe off the oil off the various kinds of vegetation out there. And so that just points out the difficulty compared to the rocks of Prince William Sound of trying to remove and then begin restoring then the muddy, sandy kinds of environments that we find in Louisiana and other parts of the Gulf of Mexico. There are not effective ways really to do that. So we end up with some oil marshes, as was pointed out earlier, particularly the 100 miles west of the Mississippi River in the Barataria Bay area, where there is still a significant amount of oil on the beaches and in the wetlands area. And this is a common shot of what it looks like entering the wetlands, that at a certain level you see the oil attached to the marsh vegetation, and that's the way it remains today. Billy Nungasser, who referenced to local officials earlier, is a well-known figure in Louisiana and very outspoken, is one that's happy to point out where the oil is. And so there is still oil in the system that people can see 30 to 40 feet out. The tide is out. He said there's no mechanism to clean that up thus far. So Mr. Nungasser and other local officials are certainly concerned about the oil that's been identified and that the oil that has not been removed. And then again, probably debated by some in the scientific community, the fact that bacteria quickly disposed of methane from BP incident, an article that was in Science, pointing out, as was referred to earlier, there are lots of bacteria in the Gulf of Mexico who like hydrocarbons, and were they this efficient in gobbling up the methane, and are we in fact at a very reduced stage of methane presence in the waters of the Gulf of Mexico? There are official restoration efforts. Peter referred to one, and I'll begin with the natural resource damage assessment. Clearly, this is an orchestrated process involving the trustees, those who are charged with being responsible for the resources there, the living and human resources. Teams of people from the federal government, state government, and BP itself will spend several months and even years looking at areas impacted by the oil, determining what the damages were, determining what natural services provided by those habitats have been interrupted and who've been injured by those interruptions of services. And on the basis of those evaluations, agreed to presumably by all the parties, damages will be assessed. And in this case, we know who's going to pay. This is intended to be paid for by the responsible party for the spill, so presumably this will be a bill that will be largely paid by BP. And it implies that it will involve restoration in the sense that habitats will be restored. But are we really talking more about restoration of damages to people and to systems in a monetary sense than we are a physical restoration process? And then, as Peter mentioned in introducing John, the Gulf Coast Ecosystem Restoration Task Force, chaired by the EPA Administrator, has been charged with a very broad and comprehensive multi-agency, state, federal, stakeholder involvement in looking at a restoration plan for the Gulf of Mexico. This implies a very, very comprehensive look at damages to the Gulf, certainly hinged on the BP Macondo spill, but I'm sure other damages will creep under the magnifying glass as this task force works through its efforts to determine what kind of restoration plan is appropriate for this distressed Gulf system. And John can correct during the panel discussion, but unlike the NRDA assessment where BP is likely to foot most of the bill, the sources of funding to implement this kind of restoration plan are yet to be identified. And of course, there's not an awful lot of optimism in the Congress and in the administration now as to the abundance of money to spend on much of anything yet, especially an uncharted and so far unplanned sort of restoration effort. But as was referred to before, and I'm going to dwell on this for the last few minutes, the Gulf of Mexico system is clearly stressed by many more things than the Macondo oil spill, and has been for decades. And so this hiccup, as Ed, I think, termed it, Ed Overton termed it, is certainly a burp, perhaps, but compared to what restoration means in the broadest context of Gulf of Mexico systems is something that needs to be considered. There's been a lot of debate over what the perturbations to the system are a result of, and in the early days of this discussion, geologists would argue that it's a natural part of the system evolving. Delta lobes are created, new marshes are created, and at the same time, since the sediment's going here and isn't going somewhere else, we're losing by subsidence and by natural processes lobes. So we have this balance of accretion, building of land, and loss of land by very natural geologic processes. And certainly historical studies of the delta through Pleistocene times indicate that that's the case. But then, of course, the human perturbations are very clear. Levied systems to control, to allow for navigation, to allow flood control to be effective and protect citizens from the very nurturing sediments and water that feed the ecosystems have been pervasive in the delta. The navigation systems themselves have been an important part of the economy. Arguments about whether production of oil and gas in the delta system itself have caused the subsidence that has been a contributor to the sinking of parts of the delta. And certainly, as you can see front and center in this photograph, the dredging of canals for pipelines for access to oil and gas sites have affected not only the area of acreage of marsh that's there, but have affected the whole hydrology, the flow of salt and fresh waters with tides and other purposes into the wetlands, and altered that hydrologic setting to a significant degree. So the wetlands have been beat up for a long, long time. Nature has done it, storms have done it in addition to geologic processes, people have done it. And so it's on this backdrop, on this backlog of problems that we look at trying to restore the Gulf of Mexico and restore the wetlands. I'm glad I have this map in there because it was referred to by the last panel, but this just illustrates very clearly, and I'll show you a couple more that are even more dramatic, what we're talking about in terms of land loss. This is 1932 to 2000, work by the USGS and others illustrating the wetlands that have been lost, the wetlands that are threatened. And you do see in a little blip of green there in the center part, some land has been created. There is some sediment, there is some water from the Atchafalaya coming into the system, and so we are building very small parts of land. This is nothing like the system fed by the Mississippi and its tributaries or distributaries that built the delta itself. But around that sediment supply that's building very small lobes into the wetlands area now, that much of the controversy about restoration of the Gulf survives. It's a little more vivid, a little fuzzier, but a little more vivid illustration of the same sorts of thing. You can see dramatic changes and losses of wetland areas, particularly in the Mississippi River area itself, to the east and west of the delta, And then if we extend that 32 to 2050 in the central part of the Gulf, this is really scary. I mean, this is what we're looking at as having happened and likely to happen, natural processes, human processes, storms, and so forth, and then we add the oil to it. And one of the early questions added was, now, is the oil going to really add to the loss of wetlands? Will they be dealt a blow by the oil itself that they wouldn't have had otherwise, and therefore the resiliency of the wetlands will be threatened even more? I think the answer to that right now is we don't know. We'll have to see over the coming growing seasons whether these wetland pieces come back again, the ones that were oiled. But this is the footprint, this is the picture that we're looking at as we talk about restoring the Gulf of Mexico system onshore. Restoring the Gulf of Mexico system offshore, it's hard to imagine anything we would do physically to go in there, even if we found oil in the traditional form on the bottom, and actually try to restore those habitats. There aren't any practical ways. Certainly we can restore the species, the ecosystems that depend on that, if they're commercial, by managing the captures of those systems and trying to manage those natural systems with our human efforts. But then you get into arguments over, well, are the red drum down this year because of the oil, or are they down because they're in one of their down years that they go through anyway? Same thing with other species. So it's a very complex thing. But physically, we won't restore the Gulf of Mexico systems in terms of bottom conditions or water conditions. Physically, we can restore the wetland systems, not so much by going in and cleaning up the oil that's coating the vegetation or still left in the sands and muds on the beaches and in the margins of the wetlands, but by restoring, by reestablishing those forces that created the delta in the first place. And this is where it gets really interesting and very difficult. There is a plethora, if that's the right word, of plans to restore coastal Louisiana. Secretary Salazar mentioned that this morning, that in his looking at the history of the depredation in some senses of the Gulf wetland systems, there have been many efforts and many plans put together to restore these, and they have an interesting history because they all, not all, many in some form, try to replicate what nature did in building the delta. In other words, getting more water, more sediment into areas that are being lost as wetlands disappear through subsidence and through disappearance by other means. They all have evolved to some degree from being dependent on relatively small projects, diversions of water, diversions of sediment that have been relatively successful, but postage stamp, if that large, in terms of their impacts. And so the great wish, the great hope has been, boy, if we could just find a way to pump the amount of water and the amount of sediment into the system that was there originally, we would have a chance to restore that red, raging red wetland area to some sense of the habitats that it was before by creating the sediment substrate upon which these marsh vegetation could grow. So we've gone from small systems with the BRO Act, the QIPRA kind of program, to great schemes and ideas about big systems. The problem is big systems run into big controversies, run into big conflicts with the existing infrastructure, with the existing economy, with the existing settlement pattern, with all of those things that are held dear in the South Louisiana area, but which are at risk, and which, if you bring in a lot of water and sediment, you put them more at risk by them being in the way. So, sediment and fresh water. How do you bring large amounts of water and sediment to restore the wetlands? Well, there are those, and there's another set of numbers that's being debated accurately. There are those who say, no way. There's just not enough sediment in the Mississippi River system to do that again. The dams on the Missouri in particular have trapped significant amounts of sediment, so it isn't even getting to Louisiana anymore. Because of the required diversion of a third or so of the flow down the Atchafalaya, some of it goes down there, and to change that pattern would require, literally, according to some, an act of Congress. So if we don't have enough sediment, and if we have problems getting it in the right place, we're starting off with one hand tied behind our back. How do you get the sediment that comes down the river that's there into the right place? Right now it comes down the Mississippi, heads out past Venice and drops off the edge of the continental shelf. That's not doing any wetlands any good at all. It's not getting into the wetlands by overbank flooding because the levees are there to protect people that keep it from getting there. So, zoom, it's out to sea. Well, geez, if we could just find a way to get that sediment into the wetlands, whatever amount's there, and the fresh water, we got a chance. So there have been all kinds of ideas. Run it down the Lafourche Old Distributary. Do it. Well, of course, the people in Lafourche weren't necessarily excited about that. The most recent and interesting thought is, well, let's just chop off the lower part of the Mississippi River. We don't need that, in a sense. Create a new mouth for the Mississippi, right at about the present coastline of the main part of the coastline of the state. Let that water head laterally into the coastal wetlands area, so the sediment that's there ends up on the shelf, washed into the wetlands, and has a chance to nourish that. Well, it's an interesting idea. Geologically, it makes a fair amount of sense. Navigation people aren't too crazy about it, even though people will argue that really it would make a shorter trip up the Mississippi if you brought shipping up at that point. So here's a big scale, big idea to restore the wetlands beyond the oil spill, beyond the small demonstration projects, that manages the water and sediment at the scale it needs to be managed, that amount that we actually have. And so it's in play right now. So some of the coastal plans, the state's master plan, for example, that has come about mentions those sorts of things. The Corps is a little reluctant to even consider something of that magnitude. It kind of scares the heck out of them, actually, because it really flies in the face of navigation, flood control kinds of things. So moving the federal agency, understandably, beyond that point of entrenchment is hard. But there are people thinking about that sort of thing. And then certainly the major infrastructure modifications that I mentioned before are factors that have to be dealt with. How do you handle the levees, and how do you handle the navigation, and how do you handle flood control in light of making major changes like that? The point of all this really is that restoration plan for the Gulf, if it's seriously going to affect areas of the Gulf in general that need restoration, and particularly the wetlands and beaches, is going to have to involve restoring the wetlands in a large-scale sort of way. That goes beyond the oil spill, but the problems of the Gulf, as pointed out by the previous panel, go far beyond the oil spill and is part of a much greater need. Perhaps, as pointed out, that the fact that the attention has been drawn to the Gulf, that people nationally are understanding the scale of the problem, and that the kinds of numbers that we who are in Louisiana argued for years should make a national impact, the amount of fisheries, the amount of migratory birds, the fur bearers, all of those things that are so critical not just to the economy of the Gulf states, particularly Louisiana, but are critical to the country, depend on these ecosystems. So restoration has to imply more than restoring the oil spill effects. It has to imply restoring a Gulf Coast system that the country depends on for many purposes. So if we're going to restore the natural systems, then we're going to have to depend on time, the weathering of the oil, the removal of the oil, hopefully non-anaerobic approaches to removing the oil and other products from that. And so time will have to do it. I think the arguments for scientific understanding that we didn't get from ICTOC, that we need to get from this, are certainly pervasive and certainly very strong, and hopefully the BP funding will allow that to happen. So we have a better understanding, and we who live in the Gulf area have argued for decades that we are kind of the forgotten ocean, and that the reason we need so much science in the Gulf is because we haven't had so much in the past, and hopefully this will draw that monitoring and assessment kinds of scientific capabilities into the Gulf that we haven't had to the past, and that we will do an adequate job of monitoring the recovery and the restoration efforts. And let me close with the latest chapter. Most of the plans that I outlined in that slide were restoration plans. They were concerned with habitats. They were concerned with ecosystems. They were concerned with beaches and barrier islands to protect the coast. Hurricane protection really wasn't a top priority because we really hadn't had a really bad one for a long time. So the thought was the natural system and its productive role in nature and in human systems. Then 2005, two major hurricanes within a month, Katrina and Rita, devastated the Gulf Coast area. And I'm not going to go into that story, but I certainly want to say that that does have a way of changing thinking, because the effort certainly and understandably and not arguably has turned to how do we do a better job of understanding what protection means of lives and property, not only physical, constructional, engineering sorts of things, but relocational things and that approach to hurricane protection. So most of what we've seen now and the funding that we've seen directed into the Gulf of Mexico, into Louisiana, and particularly into the New Orleans area has been for hurricane protection, to put up walls and levees and solid structures and gates and water control structures that will protect those people and property. Certainly not everyone in the coastal area is going to be protected, but the major centers. So how do you then work backwards in a sense and say, well, restoration needs to be part of hurricane protection, much like hurricane protection in the earlier days, we're saying that needs to be part of the restoration plan. Well, now we're flip-flopped again. So how do you build a hurricane protection system that doesn't add woes to the losses of wetlands, so that you shut off waters, that you shut off sediments? Tough job. Tough job. Caught in the middle of all this is the Corps. Caught in the middle of all this is the state of Louisiana's coastal agencies and the scientific community. So we're back in it again, slugging it out, arguing it out, and hopefully the science that comes out of all of this concern about the spill and concern about the wetlands and concern about hurricane protection will lead us to a plan that's truly integrated, truly serves purposes, and most importantly, as Secretary Salazar pointed out, gets over that problem that the area's had for so long: no money. How do you pay for not only hurricane protection, but how do you pay for restoration of the Gulf? Great challenge, great opportunity, a great resource that the nation owes an awful lot to, and that is well worth the investment. Thank you.